As introduced, my name is Una Malcolm, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to follow the incredibly impactful message and sort of dissemination of the report's finding from Karen and Megan. And really what I just like to do is to pull some of those pieces together and then set you up for another wonderful presentation with Scott from Evergreen. So good things more to come. Yeah, that's for sure. He's giving me the thumbs up. So I did just sort of want to start by setting the context that this topic that we all care so much about, right? We care so much about to come and spend a lovely evening together in a very, very busy October. This is one that does generate a lot of strongly held and sometimes strongly voiced opinions. So that is something you may have seen some reporting in the news. You may have seen some commentary around this issue throughout the commission's process, and really just speaking more broadly to literacy instruction across Manitoba. And just what I really wanted to highlight, and sort of what the focus of some of our conversation will shift to and we'll really focus on, is that idea is even across those sort of strong voices, there are often a lot of core commonalities that are shared across different duty holders who work in this space. So with that, Alicia is going to be my magical Menti manager, right? You're on it? You're good? Okay, am I good to swap over? Okay, I'm going to give you a moment. I'm going to advance the slide. This is the same Menti that you submitted questions for the commission. So it's just advanced a little bit. And am I good to show? Thank you. That is helpful. Okay. So I'll give you a moment to pop in your responses and to get that rolling, but really just wanting to set the context in terms of some framing thoughts for our conversations tonight. And I'll pop forward and just highlight this goal that so many of you endorsed as being such a core element, right? Supporting students in realizing their right to learn to read. How are we doing in this goal? And this is something that was certainly touched on in the earlier presentation, so I will go through this. I won't belabor this point, but recognizing that we do have data, we do have information in terms of how we are doing specifically in Manitoba towards realizing that goal. So we saw EDI data earlier. We saw some data on provincial assessments. What you have here is data from the Pan-Canadian assessment, which works with 13-year-old students, and this works across Canada. So I'll just highlight a little bit for you. This lighter blue bar represents the Canadian average, and you'll see that each of these bars of the darker blue highlights a Canadian province or territory. And what you'll notice here is really seeing persistent patterns in Manitoba of weaker performance in these reading scores across Canadian provinces. And then looking at this, we can see this and then certainly connect to some of the data presented earlier, specifically around provincial reading assessment scores, highlighting that when zooming in on grade 3 reading scores, we see around a 50-50 split in terms of whether we're seeing students who are meeting expectations in grade 3 versus those who are not. So I'll give you a minute to sit with that. And then I'll just pop you forward one more to recognize that when we tease out students, Indigenous students, we see that high proportion of not meeting expectations amplified even further. So we see 72% of children, Indigenous children, not meeting expectations on the provincial reading assessment. And really highlighting, across different sources of data, triangulating those sources of data, really highlighting, sort of pervasive patterns in terms of difficulties in acquiring those foundational reading skills that we want for all students, that we all endorse together. So with that, I think my magical Menti manager has advanced that, and I will pop you back. Same Menti link. We've got a couple of questions for you here. So we'll just ask you, these data, these outcomes that we see for students, are these what we want for children? Are we okay with these data? Do you want me to show them? Yeah, I can show it.
Show it.
Show it. I'll show it. Not a fast process, though. Bear with me. Okay, so from my count, I see 97, is that 97%? 97% of you identified no, that these are not, outcomes that we would be comfortable with for our children. And I think, is that 3%?
3%.
3% who highlighted you weren't quite sure. And if you can...
3% who said yes.
3% who said...
Yes.
I hear it was an accidental response. So is it fair?
I was kind of wondering about that.
Take it back. Is it fair to say we're at 100?
Yes.
We're at 100, yeah. I appreciate the clarification from the front row, thank you. All right, and I think the magical Mentimeter has advanced. There we go. And I'll just give it a moment before I pop it onto my big screen so you can see the next question of can we do better, right? I was going to say many of you, all of you highlighted, these outcomes are not ones we're comfortable with. Is this something where, is there room to improve? Is this something where we can make this actionable for students?
And we're getting lots of hearts too. I'm appreciating that, but I don't think you can see it on this particular view. But thank you for the heart emojis that are flying up.
Much appreciated.
You can probably.
I can advance.
Oh, and more hearts. I love that. Thank you.
This one, I think everybody read the question correctly. So this is great, right? We're good? Awesome, rocking it. So this is fabulous to see, right? Again, recognizing, yes, there is work to be done, but certainly this is within our capabilities and this is within our capacity and frankly our duty to children and to helping them realize their rights. So with that being said, thank you for sharing those. There we go. My goal is to learn the keyboard shortcut for that full screen in and out. That's my goal for next time. Okay, so it does go, this is something where it is worth stating really clearly. This is not by me, by any stretch saying, we can magically solve this all in one fell swoop by rethinking how we're going to be teaching reading. We know that children live and learn in very complex ecosystems, and there are a lot of societal impacts that do connect quite clearly, directly and indirectly to learning outcomes. So this is not me minimizing them by any stretch, but what I do want to highlight is that we know from a wide body of research that instruction is one of those most powerful, what some might call alterable factor or changeable factor. This is something where it is a malleable construct in terms of how we support children to learn to read in our schools. And we know that this malleable construct can have huge impacts for students in the present day and also across the trajectory of their lives. So I do just want to start with that caveat and recognizing, yes, it is a complex issue, but we do have a tremendous opportunity when we focus on instruction. And what I do just really want to highlight, again, recognizing there are, often strongly held opinions on this issue, but I do just want to start by emphasizing some of those key commonalities and converging agreements around the shared goal of why this work matters and what this work means for students. So what I'm going to do, I've got a couple of quotes from a letter that was posted and shared with the newspaper. And I just like to, I'll walk you through some of the quotes and what I think we'll start with is just recognizing, key areas of agreement. And I'll highlight when I agree. And so far we're at 100%, so you might agree. I think you probably will. So just, I'm gonna pull out a couple of lines and we'll see where we get. But this was something that was identified in a letter to the editor, that all kids need to know how letters correspond to sounds. And I totally agree. I'm seeing some thumbs up with me. You guys are good, right? I wasn't even, right? Okay, we need to know that. Kids need to know that. Fabulous. We need to know, right? All kids teach this, all teachers teach this, and all kids should know it. It's basic. So we'll come back to that. I see some hands moving around. What about that part of all kids should know it? It's basic. I'm there, right? Okay. What about this element of, but it, right, connecting letters to sounds, sounding out words, it's not all there is to reading. Reading is so much more than sounding out words. I'm there, I agree, right? Okay, fabulous. And then you may have read this. This was a letter to the editor from Brian O'Leary, the former Deputy Minister of Education. So just pulling some pieces out. We're going to come back to it because I think there are a lot of pieces that, again, really support some of our work in terms of what this looks like to support students in realizing the right to learn to read. So while absolutely, yes, This is certainly not me ever saying that kids need to learn to sound out words and that's all that they need to learn. Not at all, right? Recognizing that certainly all the skills that contribute to skilled and proficient reading, and then all the benefits that skilled reading affords, right, in terms of academically and then also across the child's lifetime. As the Commission really highlights, those foundational skills can be a powerful bottleneck for all those skills that happen downstream, right? Thinking about that on the reading side, and then also thinking about it on the writing side. By all means, these are not the only skills we want our students to develop, but when learning those skills becomes challenging or is challenging, it can have pervasive impacts on many, many other elements of a student's life in school and outside of school, as we've heard so keenly this evening. So, coming back to this, and I think I might sort of capture some of where the hands went a little bit, not quite as convinced. If we dig into this idea of this is a current area of instruction, this might be the point where we might sort of have some discussion around this. And what I would highlight is, yes, this idea that, certainly word recognition instruction is absolutely a key element of teaching, right? I strongly agree with that. However, what we know from some of the, you might call them the reading wars, you might think about it more broadly as current perspectives towards teaching instruction, how this word recognition is taught has shifted, and we'll come back to this idea of, it may or may not necessarily be connecting to the research that we know on how kids develop reading, how we can best teach, and how we can intervene when those skills are hard. So again, not to belabor the point, but recognizing, that there have been varying approaches to teaching those word reading skills across our history. You'll see, a lovely Dick and Jane book there that speaks to the whole word approach of teaching children to read, where they were learning isolated words as single units, and then, when a sufficient word bank was built up, they were reading not predictable text, they were reading controlled text that were constructed only of those words, which sort of shifted to that whole language approach, recognizing that for many children, learning to speak and to understand spoken language is, relatively developed often with limited explicit instruction. So too must be learning to read, recognizing that, sort of immersing children in a print-rich environment is certainly sort of an important way of getting them going and getting them off on the right foot in learning to read words. And then, recognizing again, these times that I've put here are rough estimates, but that evolved into a balanced literacy perspective of which can mean different things to different people, but we're going to tease that apart in a minute, and just recognizing that I would make the case, and we'll come back to this idea, that across these sort of iterations and different shifts in terms of how we're teaching kids to read words, we may not necessarily have been hitting in and zeroing in on what we know from research is the best way to teach kids to read. So, if we come back to that letter to the editor, just to pull on that thread of that idea of balanced literacy, right, we can see that this letter highlights that in a balanced literacy approach, which, is sort of was the predominant way of teaching reading recently and, is in a period of flux right now, students are also, in addition to having some phonics instruction, students are also being asked to use additional cues to identify words, such as what word might make sense, or potentially using the illustrations. And again, this is coming from, from a letter to the editor. Now, what is often, and I'll flash you forward, what a sort of an expression that is often used is this idea of a pendulum swinging. And that's one that's very inherent to thinking about how instruction has shifted in terms of how we approach teaching reading. And it's often sort of said with that idea of things will just swing back, right? They're swinging one way, it's going to swing back the other way. Now, what I would contend, and I'm going to propose sort of an alternate framework of what this looks like, what I would contend is that this sort of expression might not necessarily be fully capturing, what our progression towards what we know as evidence-based practice for instruction. So what I would contend instead is this premise, humor me, but this premise that we have an emerging and continually growing body of research that again highlights how reading develops for kids, how we can best teach it, right? What we know are what works practices, which we have research to support, what that looks like in terms of assessing and evaluating reading, and then what that looks like in terms of intervening when those reading skills are difficult to develop or when students show difficulties. And what I would highlight that instead of thinking about it as a pendulum swing of our approach is moving back and forth, this idea that we have this target, this goal, and we need to be, and we haven't yet, I would contend, we haven't yet fully connected our instruction to what we know from research. So I would carefully and respectfully sort of suggest shifting of that focus in terms of not necessarily pendulum swinging one way, for only it to inevitably swing back the other way, but to really think about how closely connected are we and how aligned are we with the broad and diverse and rich body of research that we know exists. And with this in place, just to tease on that idea of sort of evidence and what that looks like for research, there are lots of different approaches to research, and there's lots of different valuable elements of different types of research, right? But what I would highlight is when we're thinking about that decision making in terms of what works for students and how we're making decisions around how we're going to respond and how we're going to teach, we can see something that you might see referred to as the hierarchy of evidence in terms of recognizing that different types of evidence can answer different questions. So I'll highlight what this looks like, and then I'll give you an example connected to some research studies as well. But recognizing at the bottom of this pyramid, we're really looking at personal experience and personal opinion. And this is something that is uniquely human. As human beings, we all have our own opinions, we all have our own experiences. This is something where it's just part and parcel of being a human being. The challenging thing, though, is that our experiences can be limited. We are only aware of our own experiences. We're limited longitudinally. We don't necessarily have that same way of digging in and testing what do we know works for students, and how does that guide how we can be making decisions instructionally for students. One step up from personal experience or anecdote, we have expert opinion, again, recognizing that, could bring additional context to that type of decision making. But again, recognizing we're not necessarily at that part of this pyramid where we have strong, rigorous data that helps us feel confident that we're making those decisions based on the data that we know we should be. We can dig into case studies, right? Recognizing case studies are research studies that look very closely at a very small, maybe a small system of students that again really describe and offer a description of what that looks like for that particular context. But again, not necessarily getting into something where we can dig into what is the impact and what works of these different types of instruction. We can take that one step further and look at a correlational study that looks at relationships between variables, again, telling us as one thing increases, the other thing increases or decreases, shows us the relationship, does not necessarily tell us this is a practice that works. We do get that, though, when we get into quasi-experimental and experimental research. And these are types of studies where we might have multiple students, multiple groups of students, multiple classrooms, multiple schools, multiple districts, and we're looking at carefully manipulating a variable, multiple variables, controlling it with different comparison group or control group, so we can feel comfortable that any difference that we see in outcome, we can feel relatively confident it comes from that change or that intervention or that treatment that we were very interested in. These are the types, experimental and quasi-experimental studies, are those types of research designs that lets us explore causal questions. What happens when we teach phonemic awareness this way? What can we expect for student gains? What's the impact or efficacy of this type of reading intervention? What type of gains can we expect for students? And then over time, this should say meta-analysis and systematic review, but systematic review just does not fit in a triangle that tiny. But it's just pretend it's there. But over time, as the field progresses and as more and more studies build up on this topic, and as we know more and more, we have the opportunity to look at what's called meta-analyses or systematic reviews. And these are types of research designs that really take a synthesizing approach and highlighting across these many studies, what are the big trends? What are the things we know across a wide body of research? Again, giving us more confidence that these decisions we're making in terms of instruction are ones that we can expect stronger student outcomes for. So, what does this mean in terms of a topic? Now, I dug into spelling because I love spelling instruction, and I will just I'll walk you through a couple of these layers of this pyramid in terms of how this connects to what we know and an example study or an example design to elaborate on that. So, personal experience around spelling, we all have one, right? We all have one. We're human beings. I gave an example there. Kids can just use spell check these days, right? We all have opinions and thoughts on something as uniquely human as spelling. Fine. Does it necessarily give us the information we need to make good decisions around instruction? I would argue no. We could dig in to a case study around spelling. In this instance, it was a case study that dug really deeply into a highly proficient reader and looking at what that experience was like for that child learning to read and how that correlated or corresponded to their spelling development. So that, again, really deep dive, descriptive. Is that something that we can generalize across an entire population? No. Is that something where we have that confidence that those decisions we're making for instruction are based on good data? Not yet. We could take that a step further and look at a correlational study. This is one where researchers looked at the prediction. They looked at the prediction of students' handwriting and spelling skills in kindergarten and how that connected to downstream, bigger picture outcomes of their reading, right? So again, okay, great. Is that something where our students who are stronger spellers likely to be better readers, right? That's that type of design the researchers looked at. Is this something where it tells us how we can best teach spelling? Not yet. But, if I show you an experiment, and in this instance, you'll see the title here is The Impact of Supplemental Handwriting and Spelling Instruction with First Grade Students Who Do Not Acquire Transcription Skills as Rapidly as Peers, a randomized controlled trial. This particular study looked at a particular instructional approach for some students, had that really careful manipulation of what it is we're interested in, this particular way of teaching, gave it to some students, and then we were able to see the impacts of that type of instruction and feel pretty confident around our decision making of this might be an evidence-based practice that we should think about bigger picture. And then again, recognizing that we've got lots of studies on spelling, we could pull it back even further. And here's a lovely meta-analysis that actually is, I believe, open access. And I'm happy to send it to anybody who would like to read it because it has a very compelling title. Does spelling instruction make students better spellers, readers, and writers? A meta-analytic review. So if anybody is interested in reading this, happy to email it to you. But the long and the short of it is yes. So this is something you can read it, or I can just tell you yes to all three. But in this meta-analysis, it really did dig into, okay, what are the impacts of spelling instruction? And then looking into different types of spelling instruction. So this particular meta-analysis found that explicit spelling instruction was more effective than, they framed spelling as taught, not spelling as caught. So they sort of dug into some of those elements of effective practice. So again, really highlighting that, we know a lot, we've got a lot of research, and one element that I will happily link to, and again, we're happy to send this file to anybody who wants to dig into it, but Dr. Reed Lyon has developed a list of what he calls 10 maxims. And these are really sort of clear, plain language distillations of what we know from a lot of different research. And you'll see he really highlights here, he emphasizes that direct, systematic instruction helps students develop the skills they need to become strong readers. He also cautions, indirect 3-cueing instruction is unpredictable in its impact on word reading and leaves too much to chance. So again, this document is all over the internet, and then if you really, again, if you want to dig in, if you're the kind of person who reads the spelling meta-analysis, you might also, there's also a document where it unpacks all the references and all the studies that goes into each of those 10 maxims. So if you want to really dig in, there's options there, but the big piece to recognize is these are summaries and syntheses of a lot of different studies on a topic. And this really matters, right? This idea of learning, leaving too much to chance. And this is something where I'm echoing some of the key words from Karen and Megan, recognizing that when we leave too much to chance for children, that early difficulty can spiral and snowball and can stretch across a child's academic career and beyond. So just to highlight, if you're not familiar with the Matthew effect, it was coined by Dr. Keith Stanovich, who is a former, among many roles, former University of Toronto professor. And he really highlights this pathway that our stronger readers start, right? And this is something where when learning to read starts and when it develops with ease, this is something where it can often feel pretty good for kids. We're humans, we tend to like doing things that we feel good at, and we tend to do more of it. We don't necessarily see those same positive feedback cycles for students where they have early difficulties learning to read. And the big thing I would really highlight is that this difference that early on in students' career that starts quite narrow and quite small only widens over time. The Matthew effect is sometimes coined, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And we know from research, this quote here, you'll see reading difficulties that begin early in life are devastatingly stable across a child's school career. So recognizing that this decision-making, that we would want to be guided by the wide body of research that, informs us how reading develops, how we can teach it, and how we can intervene, that type of decision-making really matters, recognizing how this stretches across a child's lifetime. And again, this is something where, reading instruction, it's too important to leave to chance. So again, recognizing this is a very complex issue and there's a lot of factors that contribute, what are some things that would need to be in place, right, for all students to realize their right to be a reader? And this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch, right, not an exhaustive list, but just some things that, are key elements that we identified and also that we see, reflected in the report. Recognizing research-aligned curriculum, the importance of those documents guiding practice across the province. Thinking about high-quality instructional resources to support the implementation of that curriculum in the class, to support educators in that work. Recognizing we need evidence-based interventions for those students who need intensified services and who need additional support learning to read. And these interventions for our most vulnerable learners need to be one that have research supporting their use and their effectiveness and efficacy. We know to make all these pieces happen, the instruction, the intervention, we need cohesive and evidence-aligned systems of assessments, right, to support educators in asking and answering questions about students. And then to make all of these pieces happen, we need professional learning, recognizing we need that for in-service educators, job-embedded professional learning and coaching, and also to look at pre-service teacher education. To ensure that that's grounded in research, right? So again, not an exhaustive list, but just some pieces that, that certainly converge in supporting this type of practice that we know is necessary for every child to realize their right to learn to read. And this is something where, I think about so many of the messages earlier today, recognizing, the incredible commitment of educators in supporting students in realizing this right to learn to read. You'll see that the letter to the editor really highlighted, teachers in Manitoba are sincere in their desire to teach all their students to read and to read well. And I'm sort of reflecting on the juxtaposition of this incredible commitment of the work of educators and how that coincides with some of the findings identified in the report, particularly around feelings of preparation for the work that comes with supporting students on the job and in the classroom, and recognizing that challenging space of wanting so clearly and so importantly to be able to support students, especially our most vulnerable learners, and sort of some of those systemic factors that make that much more difficult. So really sort of pulling this apart. Now, I have the delight of working nationally, so I'm going to highlight just a brief survey for you. And you know, certainly there were Manitoba pre-service teachers who participated in the study, but this was a recent study that was conducted by several Canadian researchers, I think around 10 or 12, and around 800, 900 elementary pre-service teachers were given a survey of linguistic knowledge and connected to pedagogy as well. Now, this survey occurred after their language and literacy coursework in their pre-service training. And just for context, the researchers set 80% as that threshold for what they deemed as proficient with a particular skill or skill domain. So I'll narrate this because I know this might be small if you're at the back, but I'll read it for you so you can see what it is. And the researchers really broke out student responses across a couple of domains. For phonological awareness, so the ability to work with sounds and units of sound in oral language, pre-service teachers answered 65% of those questions correct. When it came to phonics, so thinking about connecting those sounds in language to a letter or a combination of letters, we saw around 62% were answered correctly. But when it came time to questions that dug into morphology, so units of meaning within language, we see that drop to around 37% of questions were answered correctly, which really pulls together that total, again, summing across that as around 55%. And I see lots of pictures being taken. There is, this is linked, but there is a preprint available. So if you are interested in reading this survey, it is freely available, and I strongly recommend reading that. The challenging thing that the authors highlighted was this performance and these data were very similar to data that were found 10 years ago, recognizing, you know, there's been very limited gains in terms of shifts towards pre-service teacher education, and specifically how that connects to student outcomes, to instruction and to student outcomes. Awesome. So just as I sort of start to think about wrapping up and supporting and, you know, yielding over to the fabulous Scott, you know, when I reflect back on my reading of the report and of the recommendations that have been issued and of just this synthesis of not only incredible work by the Commission, but also powerful voices and stories of so many people, individuals, groups who contributed to this report, it really highlights to me that incredible opportunity for, you know, for systems to dig in and to explore what this could look like in terms of shifting practice to meet the needs of our learners. And I really tease that out not only in terms of meeting the needs of our students, but also for meeting the needs of our teachers in our systems. I think about some of those issues highlighted in that systemic issues section in terms of how this connects to how our systems are structured to meet the needs of kids, teachers, and then more broadly the communities and the schools and the context that they operate in and that they work in and live in. And I'll just close by highlighting just this quote from Mark Seidenberg, and he highlights this idea that barriers between education and science only exist as long as we allow them to, which was something that I really identified with as we think about the important work happening in a fabulous Manitoba School Division. So with that, I will say thank you very much and welcome, Scott, and I will try and swap over to your slides.